what we did yesterday.
Oh boy. What time you daven? 12 o'clock?
Lunch for noch, the Mechitten said to me, in Chabad, we daven nates. Was heißt nates? Either noch 10, kann sein noch 12, oder noch 2.
Very good.
It's a
Very
great
good.
one.
It's a good one.
I like
Very
it.
good.
Really good.
Very good. Excellent. So it was nice, Shabbos?
Yeah, Baruch Hashem.
You daven by the oil?
No, I'm saying the oil, when we start davening, it's only 10:30.
Okay.
You don't get to lunch till 1:30.
Right. Yeah.
I think they washed to lunch, it was around 3:30. So that went till 6:30, and then mincha break. They're on their own schedule. It was Baruch Hashem. It was beautiful. Really,
So
really
Mailam
nice.
in his man.
Mailam in his mind.
Beautiful.
They brought a Sefer Torah. I got an Aliyah, I think, for the first time in, I don't know how, 8 weeks, I guess.
Wow.
Uh,
Beautiful.
So
So now we have to see if we can get oil back. Or else they won't give up already.
You have enough vodka over there?
yeah. Baruch
I guess
Hashem.
Dave is having a problem here.
Victor, have you been getting any of my WhatsApps in the last 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Is it showing you're not getting them?
Yeah, there's a glitch. You'll shut down the meeting.
Oh,
and
really?
reopen.
Because usually when you get it, I get 2 checks.
If you send it to the group, you don't get the 2 checks.
Unless everybody sees it.
Unless right.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you swipe left on your message bubble, then it'll tell you who read it. So I can see that only you and Yossi read my "get back in the pool" message.
Swipe left on the message bubble.
No, but I read it.
You read the "get back in the pool"?
Yeah, and I don't agree with you. I think you do get 2 checks when it's sent. You may not get 2 blue checks,
You don't get 2 blue checks.
but you will get, even on a group chat, you get 2
you
checks.
get
when
one.
it's
You
sent.
only
You
get
get
1
1 check.
You got 1 check in the group.
Right.
I have plenty of, I'm scrolling up, I got plenty of 2 checks.
Can Dave Zulte hear us?
No, he was in and then left. Now he's back.
But he can, I don't know if he can hear us. I cannot hear him.
No.
So there's some type of glitch over here.
Are we 8 maximum?
Well, I can't seem to get audio. So Dave Zulte is saying that.
Yeah.
Should we tell him to log out and log in again?
Tell him to dial in by phone with the regular foot. Here's the phone number.
647-558.
You know by heart?
Yeah.
I did.
647-558.
I have it right here in front of me.
Okay.
Yeah, I see Shmuel's connecting in with video, and there's no audio on
I'll
Shmuel's
type it
connection.
in. We have it here. 647.
Interesting.
No, the only one who doesn't have audio is Dave Zulte. Everybody else has audio.
647-558.
I just got my audio now. I didn't know what
There's something wrong with the audio.
647
Yeah, I have it right here. You have the number?
558-0588.
Yeah. And then he has to type in the ID number, 603-550-7613, pound, then pound again, and then 129129, pound.
Okay. Whew, we're getting there. We're getting there. So today is the
Could you put your camera on?
my camera's on. Yeah, I see Duvi. I see
No, I don't see the Gemara.
I see the Gemara. I
You don't
do.
see the Gemara?
I do.
I do. Okay, I'm gonna log back out and come back in.
Wow.
Shmuel's muted. Let's unmute Shmuel. Shmuel, can you hear us now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
I see the Gemara and I hear you.
There was some glitch this morning.
Sure.
I missed Akiva's share completely. I'm
It's
screaming.
not just us. It's all over.
I didn't miss it. I didn't
Oh,
try it.
it's on the internet. Everyone's
It's on the
complaining.
internet. It's a Zoom. Zoom's having problems.
Okay, well, what's their stock at?
Markets are closed. Can't short them right now.
Okay, so it wasn't us. I thought that Trudeau was trying to silence his critics, and he shut us off.
Everything's a conspiracy, Yossi.
You know, just because I'm a conspiracy theorist, it doesn't mean that Trudeau's not trying to kill you.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
Okay. Is anybody else on that can hear us?
Yeah.
Dave dialed in? No, Dave's not here yet.
Who just left?
Someone just left, but I know Benji. Benji, can you hear us?
No, so.
Yeah, I'm on. I'm
Oh,
on.
Okay,
good. Well,
Because there's a problem with the internet.
Oh.
No, there's a problem not with the internet. There's a problem with Zoom.
Zoom.
If you log in through the internet. So Shmuel's here. Okay, who's here now? Someone else is dialing. Oh, this is
Yeah.
Where in the world?
I just dialed in.
Okay,
oh, it's
perfect.
Dave. Okay, good.
It's hit and miss. If you, while you're on the phone, you could try logging in again, because the people who logged out and then logged in were able to restore their audio, myself included.
Okay.
So while
One
you're
of the
on the
meetings-
phone, if you can multitask while you're listening on the phone, you could try to log in again.
Or you
One of-
get the video from the computer and audio from the phone.
You can
One of the
also-
meetings comes up as not valid. One of the meeting numbers.
Looks like Akiva's having problems now.
No, I can hear,
Oh.
I can't see, but I'm going to go on to
Eva, you have
YouTube.
the name of the share. Hear no evil, see no evil.
Dave, when you were on before and you couldn't hear, were you able to
I need
see?
another coffee already.
Dave, were you able to see before?
I was able to see, but people, I saw you speaking, but I didn't hear you.
Okay,
And
so you
then-
had video,
and
but
then
didn't
I-
have audio.
And I tried again and it went blank. That thing kept turning around. Does that have a name? That thing that goes around and around?
Yeah, it's the hourglass.
Oh,
Used to be an hourglass. Yeah.
okay.
On YouTube, everything comes through clearly, the Gemara and the sound, for what it's worth.
Oh, it's live streaming. The live streaming is working.
Yeah.
It wasn't working for me.
Okay.
Okay, so should we start?
Yeah.
Mecchi didn't. I don't know if Mecchi tried to log in. I didn't see him. Okay. So today is Chav Gimel Iyar. Dave, for you, this would be interesting. One of the important things that happened on Chav Gimel Iyar was it was 38 days after we left Mitzrayim. It was the day we arrived in Refidim, which means today was the day of Mei Meriva, the day that the Be'er of Miriam got into operation. So the first Mayim Chaim company, the first Jewish beverage company, opens up today.
They just announced the
Name-
sponsor?
Second. May Mariva. So, what do you mean? When did Miriam die? The same day? Isn't it the same day that she died? That Moshe hit the rock?
No.
No.
Akiva, you're right. We have to announce the sponsors.
Yes.
So would you like to read it? Or should I read
Sure.
it? Okay, go ahead.
Sponsor for today's broadcast is Mr. and Mrs. Jack and Jody Ganslu, Nishmas Reb Tzvi, Reb Moshe, whose yard site is Wednesday, the 26th of Iyar. Any transmission, rebroadcast, or other use of this telecast without the express written consent of the Agudah Broadcasting Commission is permitted, encouraged, and applauded.
I once saw a guy write about he had a whole thing of different Torah. His website is actually called Havalim, and he says, "Feel free to plagiarize whatever you want from my site because very few people ever go here anyways."
Geweldig. Okay, so that was one thing that happened on Chav Gimel Iyar, was the Yidden arrived in Refidim and we got the Be'er of Miriam. The second good thing that happened is that even after the Hashmonaim won the war against the Greeks, it's the story of Hanukkah, so Yehuda HaMaccabi was in charge, there was a fortress, a Greek fortress called Akra, because Akra means fortress in Greek. They were not able to capture that, and there were terrorist attacks always being launched by the Greeks against the Yidden from that fortress. And also in that fortress was holed up not only the Greeks, but also the Misyavnim, the Yidden that became, that wanted to become like Greeks. And the next generation, there was someone called Shimon HaChashmonai. In the next generation, he was able to storm that fortress and get rid of them. So that's when, after the Ma'aseh of Hanukkah, we took full control over Yerushalayim. That's on the good side. On the bad side of things, one of the kinnis that we say is for to remember the tzoros that happened in the community of Worms, Vermesia. We say it in the kinnis, and the attack started today. And as a matter of fact, they came in. The attack started today, but the Yidden were holed up in the house of a poritz, of a nobleman, and they were spared. They were protected for a week. And Rosh Chodesh Sivan is when they were all brutally murdered, and because of that, this whole week is a sad week in that community. And the Shabbos in between, which is next Shabbos, is called the Schwarze Shabbos, the Black Shabbos, and they had all the minhagim of Shabbos Chazoin on that Shabbos because of what they went through. Now there was a Yid by the name of Simcha Kohen. This is also a nice little flash in the pan. Simcha Kohen he made believe like he was going to become a goy, and he was allowing them to baptize himself. And when he was in the church in the middle of his baptism, he took a knife and he killed the bishop's nephew. And then they killed him on the spot. But at least he took out our mamzer with him. Those are the interesting things. Also, more recently, in 1944, on Chav Gimel Iyar, is when the first batch of Hungarian Yidden reached Auschwitz. So a couple of days ago, the deportation started. It was a long trip. The first batch reached Auschwitz on that day. Another thing that happened is that in the 1948 war, the Israeli Air Force, whatever it was, bombed Amman, Jordan, which sort of led towards the truce. Okay, look, it's also the yahrzeit of a very chashuv Yid. His name was Rabbi Eliezer Mekamarna, who was a very chashuv Rebbe who lived in the years of the Chassidish Rebbes. Okay, let's see the Halakha Gemara. So yesterday we learned a little bit complicated Gemara, but it's going to actually be relevant to today's Gemara. So I just want to briefly run through it. So on Ayin Aleph, Omer Aleph, we discussed the concept of Ketzira, Geresh Ketzira. Once there's a carbon that's being mechaper on a malach of Ketzira, it could be mechaper on all the malachos of Ketzira that were done in the same halama, even though one was the halama of Shabbos and one was the halama of the melacha, it would be able to take care of that. And once it could take care of an earlier tzira, it could also take care of the neighbor of tchina. So there was this concept of greira by carbonis, that the effectiveness of the carbon, the effect of the carbon sort of spreads to the different chilulim of Shabbos b'shoigig to be mechaper and everything. And there was a question between Rav and Avaya how far you take it. Do you greira ligreira? Can you pass on this kapara from malacha to malacha, or it only goes one step? That was the first sugya we had. The next sugya we had was this concept of whether or not, if you prepare chelav in two different ways, such as one kazayis would be barbecued and one kazayis would be cooked, is that considered one meichel, and therefore it will be one korban for both of them because they're both the same Yisroel chelav? Rabbi Yeshua held that you would actually bring two separate karbonis for those two separate chelavs, and the Gemara came out because of that. If you had a half a kazayis of chelav that was cooked and a half a kazayis of chelav that was barbecued, they would not be mitzaref to a full kazayis of Isser. And then we got to the Machlok Shabbos and Rish Lakish. So let's look at the case. The case that they're talking about is a person ate 2 kesesim of chelav. Person ate 2 kesesim of chelav, and after he ate the second kezayis of chelav, he found out only that he ate 1 kezayis. He had not yet found out that he ate the second kezayis. And then at a later point, he finds out that he ate a second kezayis. So the discovery of the fact that he ate the chelav was in between the first achil and the second achil. So again, he ate both kezayisim. He knew nothing. He discovered that he ate kezayis number 1, and then an hour later he discovered that he ate kezayis number 2. Those are that's what the case is. So there was a machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish in that case. Rabbi Yochanan held that since he found out about the first kazayis of Chelev first, he's mechuyev achatos right away for that kazayis. And if he finds out about the second kazayis later, he'll have to bring a separate carbon for that second kazayis, because the idea in between is mechalik. Now, what's not a dispute is if a person eats a kazayis of chelev and then he becomes aware that he ate it, and then he ate a second kazayis of chelev and he became aware that he ate it, that everybody agrees you'd have to bring two separate karbanos for, because he was aware of the first achila before the second achila. We're discussing the machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is if he didn't become aware of any achilas until after he already ate both kazaysim, but he found out about one before the other. And Rabbi Yochanan holds, since I found out about one before the other, when I found out about the first kazayis that I ate, immediately triggers a chiyuv chatos. And if I find out later about another kazayis that I ate, I would have to bring a second chatos for that. Rish Lakish held, no, the mere fact that I found out about one before the other doesn't matter. I can still use the same chatos for both achilas of a kazayis of chelev. Now, there's different levels. There's, first of all, if I found out that I ate kazayis A before I found out that I ate kazayis B, that's according to one sheet is a machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. But there's a more extreme case where I found out that I ate kazayis A before I found out that I ate kazayis B, but I also acted on it and I actually bought a carbon and designated it for the chatos of eating kazayis A. So now we have a more detailed case. I ate kazayis A and I ate kazayis B and I knew nothing. I found out afterwards that I ate kazayis A and I bought a carbon to be mechaper on kazayis A, but I was not makriv it yet.
Yossi, this is on Shabbos or has nothing to do with Shabbos?
No, we're talking about chelev. We're talking about
okay.
I mean, it would apply to Isurim of Shabbos as well, but the Gemara happens to be discussing it regarding.
No, because I was just wondering how you can
Sorry?
you can buy the, if it was Shabbos you couldn't buy the carbon.
Well, the case on Shabbos would be that he did two malachas on Shabbos. He did two malachas on Shabbos, and on Sunday someone came along and he knew nothing about it. He did two malachas b'shoying on Shabbos and he didn't know about it.
Okay.
He didn't discover it until Sunday. So we're only discussing the discovery.
Okay.
This discovery could be a week, 2 weeks, a month after he actually did the violation.
Okay.
So when he actually did it is not relevant. What we're discussing now is how he became aware. So again, if now he ate both kazaysim, behelamachas, he found out that he ate kazayis A and he bought a carbon for kazayis A. There's also a machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan holds you bought a carbon, it separates it. And Rish Lakish holds, even though you bought a carbon, I wasn't makriv the carbon yet, so I can still tack on other isurim to that same carbon. So if I find out before I makriv my carbon that I actually ate a second kazayis, when I makriv that carbon will take care of both kazaysim of chelev, because when I ate both kazaysim, I didn't know in between that I ate a kazayis of chelev. So based on these different levels, there could be a machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish if I merely found out that I ate kazayis A before I ate kazayis B. There could be a machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish if I actually purchased a carbon after I found out that I ate kazayis A. But if I actually was already makriv the carbon on kazayis A, and then I first found out about kazayis B, there for sure I have to bring a second carbon. Because the carbon that I was makriv was only for kazayis A. I didn't even have a chiyuv for another carbon triggered yet when I was makriv the carbon. So everybody agrees if I was makriv carbon A before I even found out about B, of course I have to bring a separate carbon for B. The machlokes is in a case where I was merely mafresh carbon A before I found out about carbon B, but the carbon is still around. Can I also use that carbon, that same animal, to be mechaper on Avera B? That's question number one. And question number two is, what if I didn't even set aside a carbon? I merely found out that I'm chayav a carbon for kazayis A, and then I find out at a later point that I'm chayav a carbon for kazayis B. Can I use one carbon for both? So the Gemara yesterday discussed the Machlokes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan might be only if I found out that I ate Kazayis A before I found out Kazayis B. But if I actually bought the carbon, maybe Reish Lakish would agree to Rabbi Yochanan that buying the carbon now disqualifies it from being used for Kazayis B. Or maybe they're arguing only if I bought another carbon, only if I bought the carbon for Kazayis A, can I use it for Kazayis B? But if I really found out, maybe Rabbi Yochanan would be agreeable to Reish Lakish that I can still use one carbon. And then there was a third sheet in the Gemara, the third side of the Gemara, that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing in both cases. That means even if I only discovered that I ate Kazayis A before I ate Kazayis B, Rabbi Yochanan would hold that I need a separate carbon for Kazayis A and a separate carbon for Kazayis B. And they might even be arguing when I actually was mafresh a carbon for Kazayis A, and then I found out about Kazayis B, Rabbi Yochanan would hold that of course I need a separate carbon, and maybe Reish Lakish would even agree in that, would even say in that case that I could still use the same carbon. The only time I can no longer use a carbon for the other Aveira is if I was makriv already. So those are the three approaches to the Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And the Gemara was not sure if Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are arguing in both cases or in one of the two cases. So those are the three options. Now that we have Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and we need to really understand Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish because we're applying what we're going to learn, what we learned about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish to another thing. So until now, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, we're only talking about a carbon chatas. What's unique about a carbon chatas? First thing about a carbon chatas is everybody agrees that if I ate one kazayis b'shoigig, and then I discovered that I ate a kazayis b'shoigig, and then I ate another kazayis b'shoigig, and then I discovered that I ate the second kazayis b'shoigig, everybody agrees that needs two separate kabbalas. That's not a shaila. The shaila of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish is if when I ate both kazaysim, I didn't know anything, and I only started finding out after everything was over. But if I found out immediately after I ate the first kazayis that I ate chaylev, and then I ate a second kazayis, and then I found out about that one, everybody agrees, both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, everybody agrees you have to bring two separate karbanos. And the reason for it is because Yediyas Machalkos. If the carbon that you're bringing, when it's a chatos, is on the skogos. And these two skogos are separated because there was a Yediyah ben time, you knew in between that you had violated the Isser Chaylev. Now that applies to a chatos. And the Osham has a different set of rules. And now we're going to see how this applies to an Osham. So the Gemara gets into an interesting discussion. Now we know from davening every day that there's multiple types of Hashamis. So let's have a look. Ziv Cheshamis Shibav Hashamis, Elohin Hashamis. There's Asham Gezelos, which is for an Avera. There's Asham Me'ilos, which is for the Avera of Me'ilah. There's Asham Shivcha Charufa, which is for the Avera of sleeping with a Shivcha Charufa. Then there's Asham Nazar and Asham Mitzayir. The Asham Nazar and the Asham Mitzayir are not for Averas. They're when you finish your Naziris, you finish your Mitzayir, you bring it. They're not made to be mechaber on specific Averas. And then there's the Asham Tali, which is a carbon that you bring if there is something that if you did it, you would bring a chatos for, such as chaylev. If you eat chaylev, you have to bring a chatos. Well, what if I find out that what I ate was not for sure chaylev? What I find out was a suffix if it was chaylev or not. So now I don't really know if I was over for the Aveira. I know that what I ate might have been chaylev. So for that, you bring an Asham Tali because you're not sure if you did Aveira. And the Asham Tali is exactly what it says it is. It protects him from any punishment of that Aveira until he gets clarity. If he finds out later and it becomes clear that it was in fact chaylev, he will now have to bring another carbon. He'll have to bring the standard chatos that one brings if one eats chaylev b'shogeg. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today, on the Asham Tali, on the Asham Me'ilos, and the Asham Shivcha Charufa. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. So the Gemara starts off with Ula. Omer Ula, Laman da Omar, Osham Vadai loy boy yidi b'tchila. Now this is a big mouthful. It's a full kazayis, maybe two kazayisim of information that we have to explain. So Rashi tells us about a very interesting case. What happens if someone ate a piece of meat, wasn't chaylev, he ate a piece of meat, and he finds out that it might have belonged to a hektish. And if it belongs to hektish, he was moel b'hektish. So the halacha is, if someone is moel b'hektish, he has to bring an asham me'ilos. So he brings a carbon asham, which happens to be a male animal. A chatos is a female animal, but an osham is a male animal, it's a ram. And he also has to pay back the me'ilah. So let's say the value of the meat that he ate was $100. He has to pay back the hektish $100. And the chaimish, he has to add another $20 to it. So the way to get a kapara for someone who b'shoigig was moil behektish by eating meat or using something else of hektish, he has to bring an asham, A, and B, he has to pay a monetary value of keren v'chaimish. Now, what happens if someone is in the suffix of he was moil behektish? So he ate a piece of meat. The piece of meat was worth $100, and we don't know. It comes out that we're not sure that it was chulin. It might have been hektish. So now he has a suffix if he was moil behektish. So as in every other case, when you have a suffix, if you did the sever, you bring an asham tali. Now the question is, this asham tali, what happens if I'm going to find out later on that it was hektish? So why should I bring a separate carbon? Why can't I use the same carbon? So there's a machlokes if I can use this carbon and say like this. Now I'm bringing an asham tali. But if it turns out that I find out that in fact I was for sure moil, I want this carbon not to be an asham tali. I want this carbon to be an asham vadai, which would be an asham ilois. Now we know that whenever you bring an asham ilois, the carbon does not work unless you also pay up at the same time the keren v'chaimish. So when he brings this asham, let him bring this asham tali, let him give the $120 at the same time, and let him say, if it's going to be always unknown, I have an asham tali. And if I eventually find out, I want this to be an asham vadai, and I'm paying the money with it, so it covers you off, rather than having to bring another carbon later on once I find out. So there's a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rav Tarfon in increases if that's allowed. So Rav Tarfon holds that is allowed, and Rabbi Akiva holds it's not allowed. And the way we actually learn, so why does Rabbi Akiva hold it's not allowed, is because I can't make a t'nai and say that this should be a real asham, an asham me'ilois, if I find out later that I was really moil, because at the time that I brought it, I don't know if I was moil or not. And the only way you can bring an asham me'ilois is if you know for sure that you did the avera before you did it. Just like the chatos. I can't bring a carbon chatos and say, maybe I did it, maybe I didn't. Until you know for sure that you did the avera, you can't bring a carbon chatos. So Rabbi Akiva holds, until you know for sure you did the me'ilah, you can't bring an asham me'ilois. You can only bring an asham tali. Now, your Tarfon holds, what's the difference? It's exactly the same carbon. I understand by a chatos you can't do it, because the asham tali that you would bring before you know if you ate the chelev is one type of animal, and the chatos is a different type of animal, so you can't do it. But if my asham vadai and my asham tali is the same type of animal, for Tarfon, so big deal. I don't know at the time that I was for sure over, but I'll use the same animal and I'll bring it all tonight. Thank you very much. So the machlokes here is whether or not, in order to bring an asham me'ilois or any asham, do I have to know with certainty that I did the avera, or can I bring it on at night? So Amar Ula, Laman da Amar, asham vadai, loy boyidi betchila. According to the Mandam who holds, you could bring an asham on a t'nai and say that if I find out later that I actually did violate the me'ilah, this carbon should be an asham me'ilois, meaning I brought a carbon before I knew for sure that I was over this year. According to that Manda Omar, let's look at a different case. What happens if Baal Chomesh be'ilosh b'shivcha charufa? Now we need to learn about the parsha of shivcha charufa, because the asham shivcha charufa is very unique than any other type of carbon. First of all, if someone is boiled shivcha charufa b'mezid, he also brings the same asham. This asham works whether it's shogig or mezid, it works. So the pasuk by shivcha charufa says, "The ish ki yishkav es isha shichva zera, v'hi shivcha necharefes leish v'hafil nefazah chupsha v'yitla bikaris tia." And Rashi's bikaris tia means he gets malchus, because we're speaking about a mezid. And even someone who gets malchus as a mezid also brings v'hevi Hashem el Hashem el Pesach el Moed el Hashem. So what's unique about the asham shivcha charufa is that even if someone was boiled a shivcha charufa b'mezid, he can also bring that carbon. And the Mishnah tells us something fascinating, that even if he is boiled 5 shivcha charufas, even if he does the same avera 5 times, he can get away with 1 carbon. So this is a very good deal. You can be boiled as many shivcha charufas. I mean, not allowed to. It's a big issue. But even if someone was boiled 5, 10 shivcha charufas, 1 carbon will cover it all. It's literally it's a 1 price, and then it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. So it's a very unique halacha that applies only to shivcha charufa. Now, it applies to shogig as well. But since by Mazid you have this weird thing that he even if he's boiled 5 shivcha charufas, 1 carbon is enough. That tells you that the fact that he knows in between doesn't have such strength, because here by Mazid he knows every time. Yet we're still allowing the carbon to be used for multiple averis. Now, what happens if he was boiled shivcha charufa b'shogig, and he was boiled them? He was boiled all 5, and then first he found out. So that should also allow you to have that for sure. 1 carbon would be enough. If by measure it's enough, for sure by shogig it would be enough. But what would happen if he was boiled 5 shivcha charufas b'shogig, but between each one he knew about it? So by chelev, we know hands down, if he ate a kazayis of chelev b'shogig and he found out about it, and then he ate another kazayis of chelev b'shogig and he found out about it, there for sure you have to bring 2 karbanos, because the yedid ben tayim by a carbon chatos for sure splits it. But by an osham, we don't know that it would work. Maybe by an osham, even if he knew in between each osham, he knew in between each avera that he was over an avera, maybe that should not separate them into 5 karbanos, because we already see osham has different rules than chatos, and since osham has different rules than chatos, maybe only by a chatos, if he becomes aware in between each avera, he has to bring 5 separate chatoyos. But by osham, maybe even if he becomes aware in between each bia, maybe there he could still bring only 1 carbon. That's what the Gemara is playing with. So the Gemara says again, according to the Mandam who holds that a osham vade loy boy yediyah b'tchila is yediyah. We know yediyah is very significant when it comes to chatos. Like we said, if you find out in between, you have to bring another carbon. But is knowledge, is that something that's an important factor by osham? And if it is, maybe we would say that the yediyah ben tayim would split up the karbanos. So says Ula, it depends if you give yediyah validity. According to what we were saying, the Reb Tarfon holds that I could bring an osham on the suffix, meaning I could bring an osham vadai. I can say that this carbon would be work for an osham vadai, even though I didn't know at the time that I was over the avera, because he says this osham toli, you can use it, and you could say, if I never find out, it remains an osham toli. But if I eventually find out, this should be a real osham, meaning I'm technically bringing an osham without ever knowing about it before. So according to Reb Tarfon, Ula wants to suggest that knowing the fact that I found out about my avera is not important. It's not an important factor. So even though by chatos it might be a very important factor, and there could be mechalik between chatoyis, by osham it's not important. And how do we know it's not important? Because you don't even have to have a yediyah before you bring an osham vadai. By a chatos, for sure you have to know about it before you bring a chatos. So from the fact that you don't need to know about your avera before you bring an osham vadai, that would tell us that knowledge of the avera is, although it's an important factor by a carbon chatos, it's irrelevant by an osham. So if you hold that knowledge about an avera is irrelevant by an osham, so then bol chamisha be'ilos b'shivcha charufa, if he was boiled 5 be'ilos by shivcha charufa, and he knew, and it was al b'shogig, but in between each bia, he actually discovered that he did an avera, whereby chatos for sure it would mandate 5 separate karbanos. By the bia shivcha charufa, maybe eini chayv al achas. Why? Because the fact that you knew anything by osham doesn't carry any weight. And how do you see it doesn't carry weight? Because you could even bring an osham vadai on a t'nai. So that's the stretch. That's the stretch that Ula wants to make. Again, the first piece of information is yediyah isn't such an important factor by osham, because we know you can bring an osham vadai, even though at this point when I brought it, I don't know that I was over the avera. By chatas, that would never be allowed. It's only allowed by osham. So once we know that the significance of finding out about the avera is diminished it's not so important, maybe then it shouldn't even separate between bias. And if there was 5 bias and there was a yediyah in between each of the bias, maybe that should still be able to bring 1 carbon. That's what Ula wanted to suggest. Frek Rav Hamnuna, Matzkav Rav Hamnuna, Elamayata, Baal v'hifresh carbon. The Bach takes out these words. Baal v'hifresh carbon. Somebody, b'mezid, was Baal on a shivcha charufa, and that's machai from a carbon. And he was mafresh to carbon, but he didn't bring the carbon yet. But Omar, and he sells the coin, hiptinuli, do me a favor, I have a carbon anyway. I paid the price for my all I can eat buffet. How about you don't be market the carbon yet? Hamtinuli, acheva, let me chaparine, let me get my money's worth, right? I'm just reading the Gemara. So are you suggesting hachanami de inechai v'lachas? Are you going to suggest now that you've made yediyah b'fnim, yediyah b'tayim is not worth anything, it doesn't accomplish anything, so that means you need to say 1 carbon could work for any amount of violations. So you're going to tie it that someone could say such a thing? That's very, very difficult to accept. So Omer Lei, Ula answered back to Rav Nuna, you can't ask me a kasha from Baal v'hifresh. Ma'aseh l'achar frasha kamrit. Ma'aseh l'achar frasha loy kamina. I'm talking about yediyas. I'm saying the yediyah will not be mechalik between the bias, and therefore he could bring 1 carbon. You want to take that a step further and say, even if I was mafresh a carbon, it shouldn't be mechalik. That I never said. Okay, so that's the first side of the Gemara. Next, Kiyosher Abdimi made another similar comment. He's not arguing on Ula, but he's talking about the other svara. Kiyosher Abdimi Omar, Lemanda Omar Asham Vade Bo Yediyah B'tchila. If you hold that Yediyah is an important factor by Asham, because you would not be able to bring the Asham on its nai and say that if I find out later that I really was over the Avera, that this should be an Asham Vada. You can't say that, because you had to have known before you bring this carbon that you for sure did Avera. So that means by Asham, Yediyah is an important factor. So according to that Shita, if someone was boiled 5 bilos by shivcha charufa, and he knew in between each biyah, he discovered in between each biyah that he did an iser, whereby a chatos, for sure you'd have to bring 5 chatos. By an asham as well, chayiv al kol achas v'achas. Because since yediyah is important, we'll compare an asham to a chatos where yediyah is also important. And if you find out in between each avera that you did the avera, that triggers its own chiyav chatos, and you'd have to bring a separate chatos for each avera. Omer Abaye, perfect Abaye, hare chatos, to be inon yediyah betchila. We know by a chatos where you need to have a yediyah before you bring a chatos. You never bring a chatos unless you knew for sure you were over the avera. And nevertheless, upligi Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish have a machlokes. Now this gets a little complicated because Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are not arguing if you actually found out in between each iser that you did the avera. There, even Rish Lakish agrees you have to bring multiple chatois. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are arguing if after you did both averas, you found out about one avera first and another avera second. But again, our Gemara here looks at the yediyah by Osham as worth less than the yediyah by a chatos. So our Gemara is suggesting that if Rabbi Yochanan would hold that you have to bring a separate chatos for yediyah after the fact by chatos, then by the Osham, at least if there was a yediyah in between the averis, there for sure it should split up the chatois and bind it a second chatos. But Rish Lakish, who in our case held that you don't have to bring a separate chatos if you found out one and then the other, then by Osham, even if you found that in between the actual averis, Rish Lakish would hold that you could still bring 1 chatos. So the Gemara is asking, how could you say that even if you give yediyah an importance by Osham, it's still for sure not as important as it is by chatos. It should not be any better than a yediyah after the fact, which is the subject of the machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. And Rish Lakish would still agree, would still argue that you could bring 1 carbon for all 5 averis. And after this kasha was asked to Rav Dimi after Abaya asked this kasha to Rav Dimi, Ishtik. Rav Dimi was silent because, in fact, Rish Lakish should agree, he should hold that if a person was bought on 5 shivcha charufas, even if he found out in between, according to Rish Lakish, that should not be mechalak the karbanos. Omer lei, Dilma b'maisa d'la'achar hafrasha karban. Maybe when did Rav Dimi say that even Rish Lakish would agree that you have to bring 5 separate karbanos if you knew about the issue in between? Maybe that's only if you were actually mafresh a carbon. So he made one biyah, he became a chuy a carbon, and then he was mafresh a carbon. Then he made another biyah, and he found out about it. So he would have to be mafresh another carbon. Why? Because the original carbon would not cover the subsequent averis because he was mafresh already. And that's in fact the svar that Rav Hamnuna said earlier, that afrasha is a bigger step than just finding out about it, and that would be mechalik and mandate extra chatayos. Amalayin, you happen to be right, because also Ravin, when Ravin came, he made a cryptic statement, and he said as follows: Hakoil Moiden, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish both agree b'shivcha charufa, by a case of shivcha charufa. The Hakoil Moiden and both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree b'shivcha charufa. So there's 2 things that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, who are arguing by achatos, there are 2 things that they agree upon by shivcha charufa, and the Gemara will elaborate later what it's talking about. And umachlokes b'shivcha charufa. There's actually a case by shivcha charufa where the machlokes that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish had regarding chatos would also apply to the asham of the shivcha charufa. And now let's see what the details are. Hakol moedin b'shivcha charufa the einechai velachos. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish agree that by shivcha charufa, even if he knew in between each biyah that he did the aveira, he would only have to bring 1 carbon kedula, and that's following the first comment of Ula, which is only according to the man the Omar, that doesn't give any value to Yediyah, because he holds you could bring an ashama ilosh or any asham al suffix, even though at that point that you brought it, you didn't even know that you did the aveira for sure. So according to that shita, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, even Rabbi Yochanan, who normally looks at Yediyah as something important, that's only by a chatos. By an Osham Yediyah doesn't mean anything, and therefore, even though he knew in between each biyah, 1 carbon chatos would be enough for all 5 biyahs. 1 carbon asham shivcha charufa would be enough for all 5 biyahs. Chatos, no in between, would always mandate an extra chatos. By shivcha charufa, since Yediyahs by ashamais aren't so important, even if he knew in between each biyah that he did the avera, 1 would be enough, both according to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, who argue by chatos. Which means, in a case, if you hold that there's a big importance to Yediyah even by Asham, because you wouldn't be able to bring an Asham if you wouldn't be able to bring Asham on a suffix. You can't bring an Asham al Tnai, meaning you have to know for sure that you were over an Aveira before you can bring an Asham Vadai. So according to that man, the Omer, that Yediyah is important by Asham, and in between each biyah, he didn't just find out that he did a biyah surah. He actually went and bought a carbon for that aveira. There, both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish would agree by an asham shivcha charufa that you need a separate carbon for each aveira. And then umachlokes b'shivcha charufa, but there is a case by shivcha charufa where the machlokes of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, which was by chatos, would apply to the asham shivcha charufa as well. And that's the man the Omer Asham Vade Boy Yediyah B'Tchila. According to the man who hold that Yediyah is important by an Asham, meaning you cannot bring an Asham on a Tnai. There, if it was not Hofrash, he just found out in between, that would be the same Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan B'Shim Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan holds the fact that you found out in between requires that you have to bring a separate carbon for each violation. Rabbi Shimon Lakish holds that even though you found out in between, you could still bring 1 carbon. So they're still off from each other. Because a chatos, if you found out in between the averis, everybody would agree that you have to bring a separate chatos for each aveir. By Osham, since Yediyah is not as important a factor by Osham as it is by chatos, because you see by Shivcha Charufa, on the mazid, you could bring one carbon for 5 mazids. So by an Osham, since the idea is not as important, Reish Lakish would hold that even if I knew in between each Avera, it's still enough to bring one carbon, Asham Shivcha Charufa, for all 5 dias. Even though with a Chatas under those same circumstances, everybody would agree you'd have to bring 5 separate Chatos. So just to review, we have by Chatos, if you know about the Avera, in between each Avera. So a person did an Avera, he ate Chelev, he didn't know about it, and he found out about it. That triggered a Chiyav Chatos. Then he ate another piece of meat that he didn't know was Chelev, and he found out about that. Everybody agrees those you have to bring 2 separate Chatois. Because the fact that you found out about the Avera in between, before you did the second Avera, that automatically mandates a second Chatos. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish have a machloikis by Chatos. If I ate both kazaisim of Chatos, I ate both kazaisim of Chelev without knowing anything, and I merely got my discovery of kazayis A before kazayis B, that's where there's a machloikis of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. By Osham, where Yediyah has less value, there's a machloikis of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, even in a case where you actually knew in between each Avera that you did it. Where by Chatas, we said everybody would agree you'd have to bring separate Chatas. By Osham, there would be a machlokes of Reish and Reish Lakish. That's only if Yediyah has any value at all by Osham. And that's a machlokes Tanoim, whether Yediyah has any value by Osham. If Yediyah has a value, then the machlokes of Reish and Reish Lakish would be relevant. And if Yediyah has no value, then even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that by an Osham, you can always bring one carbon for everybody and for all the Averis, because there's no benefit, there's no value in the fact that you found out in between, because Osham doesn't depend on knowing about the Avera in between. And that takes care of this sugya, and now we're going to get into a much simpler and easier sugya. Itmar, Zok Tehelig Gemara, Nischaven Lahagbia es a Tolish. A person was walking in his field and he dropped his knife. His knife's there in the field and it's stuck in the bush, and he wants to get his knife. And he goes down to pick up his knife, and as he lifts his knife up, he cut a plant that was growing. Now that's normally if you cut down a plant, that's called culture. It's a malacha deraisa. But this fellow's intention was merely to pick up his knife. His knife was sharp, and by mistake, as he pulled it, it sliced something that cut it off. So the halacha is potter. That's going to be potter, because that's definitely not a melechas machshavas. He had no intention. It was a darshan in mechavan. He had no intention of cutting down this growing item. What about if the lachter is a tolish? He actually had a piece of vegetable on the floor. He had a carrot on the floor, and he wanted to cut that carrot, and he cut it. And then he realized that the carrot that he cut was actually not. Well, the carrot's not a good idea, because if he sees the carrot outside, it has to be tolish. He saw a stalk of wheat that was bent over on the floor. He assumed that stalk of wheat was not connected. It was already uprooted from the ground, and he wanted to cut the stalk of wheat. And after he cut it, he realized that its stem was actually in the ground and was still growing. So he intended, in the first case, he didn't even intend to do a chaticha. He just wanted to pick up a knife, and he did a chaticha by mistake. In this case, I wanted to do a chaticha. I wanted to cut, but what I wanted to cut would have been mutter to cut, because it was something that was no longer growing from the ground. But by mistake, I ended up cutting something that was growing from the ground. So in that case, Rav Omer Potter, Rav still holds Potter, because even though I wanted to do a Ma'aseh Chaticha, I didn't want to do a Ma'aseh Chaticha of a Mechuber. I only wanted to do a Ma'aseh Chaticha of a Tolish. Abaye Omer Chayiv. Abaye said that would be Chayiv, because I didn't have an intent to do a Ma'aseh Chaticha, and I did do a Ma'aseh Chaticha. That's called a Malacha. Rav Omer Potter, my intent might have been to do a chaticha, but my intent was not to do a chaticha that's osur. Abaye Omer Chayiv, because I am intending to do a chaticha, and I did a chaticha, that's enough to be mechayiv somebody. Omer Rav, how do I know that it's not enough?
Yossi?
Yes.
Sorry, so does that mean it's a mezid, according to Abaye?
No, it's a shoygig, and he would have to bring a carbon. The shaila is, do you have to bring a carbon? For sure, it's not amazing. At most, it's a shoygig.
I know, I would assume that, but they're just his lashon of niskav and the chaticha the isura You know, he
But
did
you
what
see,
he
so
did
that
what he
makes him to a
intended.
Maisa Isser. That makes him to a
He did what he
Maisa Isser.
intended to do.
That's right. So to Maisa Isser, he just did it B'Shogi. Being that you brought it up, it's probably worthwhile just to learn the second Rashi. So if you had kavanah to do the Isser, to do the Maisa, according to the Bible, had kavanah to do the Maisa, that would be a shogi. Okay. Zok the Heilige Gemara. So Rava says, how do I know that even though I intended to do the action, but the action that I intended to do was mutter, how do you know that that's also going to be potter from any carbon? The Tanya, we know it from a brisa, a long brisa. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. Shabbos is more chomer than other mitzvahs in the Torah. And at the end of the Gemara, after we have trouble, the shar mitzvahs is only one mitzvah. But at this point, it's mishar mitzvahs. The chomer shar mitzvahs mishabbos. And there are ways where other mitzvahs in the Torah are more serious than Shabbos. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. In what way is Shabbos more chomer than other mitzvahs? Shabbos, on Shabbos, Osher Shnayim Behelam Echad, if you did two malachas in one halama, chayiv al kalachas v'achas, you're chayiv on each one. Now that jumps right out at us because we know if you do katsira and then you do katsira and then you find out about it, you only bring one carbon. So this is going to require explanation, which the Gemara will provide later. Mashayka b'shar mitzvahs. The chayiv b'shar mitzvahs mishabes. So b'shar mitzvahs shogag b'loy mischaven chayiv. If you did it shogig by loy mischaven, you'd be chayiv. Mashayka b'shabes. So we need explanation. Omer. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs. Shabbos also shtayim behelam echad chayiv al kolachas v'achas. Mashayka b'shar mitzvahs. So hechidami. Under what circumstances would Shabbos mandate two separate karbonis for doing two malachas behelam echad? Ilay medavid ktsira utechina. If you did ktsira and techina, and then in fact you do bring two karbonis, because if you knew it was Shabbos, you just didn't know that ktsira was aser, and you didn't know that techina was aser, and you did those two malachas, you would bring two karbonis. So what would be an equivalent case by shar mitzvahs? The kavazak of shar mitzvahs, achal chaylev adam. If you ate a kazayis of chaylev, and you ate a kazayis of dam. But the Mishnah says, the Brisa says, that over there you would only bring one carbon. But that's not true. Hachatarti mechayiv, by Shabbos you're chayiv two, because you did two different malachas. But hachatarti mechayiv, and if you ate chaylev and dam, you would also, of course, be mechayiv in two karbonis. So in what case are we saying that this distinction applies between Shabbos, that you only bring one carbon, between Shabbos where you bring two carbonis, and others you only bring one carbon? Elashar mitzvahs, deloy mechayev, elachada hechadami. Where can I find other mitzvahs where you do multiple violations and you're only mechayev one carbon? It's the achal chaylev, the chaylev. Must mean if you ate a kazayis of chaylev and then you ate a second kazayis of chaylev, there we know, as long as you didn't know in between, you'll bring one carbon for both kazaysim of chaylev. No, the kavazak of Shabbos, what's the parallel case of Shabbos? David katsira. You did two mises of katsira b'shagig, and after you did both mises, you found out about both of them. Well, by Shabbos as well. In this case, both by the two kazaysim of chaylev, you're chayiv only one carbon, and if you do two of the same avodas, two of the same halachas on Shabbos, you also only bring one carbon. So we need to find a case where there would be a distinction between Shabbos and other averis, and right now we don't have them. So he did ksir and tchina. He did two separate malachas, and then we understand why by Shabbos he has to bring two karbanos. What does the Brisa mean to say that by other mitzvahs this halacha does not apply? It doesn't mean all halachas. It means a specific halacha. Avoid zora. By avoid zora, if you do multiple averis, one carbon is enough. If he shechted l'avoid zora, the kiter, or he was makter for avoid zora, and he was makter l'avoid zora, and v'nisech, and he also poured wine l'avoid zora, and in all three cases he didn't know that this was aser. He'll only have to bring one carbon. So by Shabbos, if he does multiple malachas b'elamachas, he has to bring a separate carbon for each malacha. But by avodah zara, if he did three different avodas b'elamachas, it's enough to bring one carbon for all three avodas. So that's a nice comparison. Chomer b'Shabbos mi avodah zara, because by Shabbos you have to bring a separate chatas for each malacha. Yet by avodah zara, you don't have to bring a separate chatas for each avodah. So So now you want to say that this brisa is speaking by avodah zarah. Well, if it's speaking by avodah zarah, let's follow through that theme and see how that fits into the rest of the brisa. There are chumras that exist by other mitzvahs than Shabbos. Shebeshar mitzvahs shogag b'loy mischaven chayiv. If you did it shogig b'loy mischaven, you would be chayiv. Masha'enkin b'Shabbos, but on Shabbos, if you did it b'shogig, you're chayiv to bring a carbon. So let's think. How shogag b'loy mischaven d'avodah zarah? What's the case of shogig by avodah zarah, where we're saying that you're going to be chayiv? Hey chedami, ilema kasavar beis hakneses v'ishtachavela. There's really a base of avodah zarah. This Yid thought that it was a bes medrash, and he bowed down to it. Frek the Gemara, that's not shogig. Harei libo l'shamayim. He didn't do anything wrong. He's bowing down. It goes bust for his heart. He's davening to Shemayim. He's bowing down to Shemayim. That's not a nevera at all. So of course that it's not going to be chayiv. Of course you cannot say that it's going to be chayiv there. The Ella, the chazi andarta v'sagidle. He saw an andarta, and Rashi tells us that an andarta is tzuras hamelech she'oisin l'kavod hamelech. It was some painting or statue of the king that they would make, and he bowed down to it. But v'lo l'shem malachos, he didn't bow down to it as a god. He bowed down to it as a king. So, let's see what the situation with that is. Hey chedami, either kabbalah lebalaya, if he accepted this statue of the king as his god, and he did it knowingly, mezidu, that's first class textbook of avodah zarah, and he gets misa for it. And if when he bowed down to the getchke, he had no intention of making it into a god, he was just showing respect for the king, lav klumu, that's also not an aver at all. So where are you going to find this case of shogig? Element ahav of a year. What must have happened is he was afraid of somebody who told him he has to bow down to this getchke, or he loved somebody, and because of that, they pressured him into bowing down to this getchke. And he thought, Rashi tells us, that if you bow down to a getchke, but you're only doing it because you're pressured, he thought that was mutter. Really, that's avodah zarah. That's bona fide avodah zarah. So that's a shogig. So if that's the shogig that we're talking about, that the avodah zarah he'd be chai for that shogig, that would be very good according to Abai, who holds that in this case of avodah zarah, if he did it ahava or miyira, he's chai, and that's considered a violation of the aver of avodah zarah. And the Rava Damar Potter, Rava holds if you bow down to something and you don't really consider it a god, you're just doing it because you're pressured, that's not avodah zarah at all. So we don't have a case. Where do we have a case of avodah zarah where it's going to be a shogig and you'll be chayav to be a carbon? So what's the case of omer mutter? Rashi says, when gerish and eskar ben enachim, kisaver she'ein avodah zarah b'Torah, he never knew that there was an iser of avodah zarah in the Torah. The korele shogag b'loy mischab. It's calling it shogag. There are shittas who hold that omer mutter is oinus, but at this point in the Gemara wants to suggest that someone who bows down to avodah zarah, not knowing that there's even a prohibition of avodah zarah, that's called a shogig, and that would be chayiv by Shabbos. Masha'enke b'Shabbos the potter lagamri. So by Shabbos, if you didn't know that there's an Isra Shabbos, or you can suggest that it's potter, Adkan loy boy minei Rava Rab Nachman. Rava had a question by Rab Nachman. What if A, I didn't know that this melacha was Asher on Shabbos, and B, I didn't know it was Shabbos. Rava Rashayla ele chiyuv achada, ile chiyuv tarti. Rava Rashayla, do you bring one carbon or two carbonis? And Rab Nachman paskin for him, you bring one carbon. Abel miftil legami loy. So you cannot tell me that under the same situation, by avodah zarah, if he did the favor and he didn't know that avodah zarah was Asher, he brings a carbon. But by Shabbos he doesn't bring a carbon, because by Shabbos as well he has to bring a carbon. Even if he didn't know that Shabbos is a problem over here, he still has to bring a carbon. So we don't have a case where there's a chumrah by avodah zarah over Shabbos. So the Gemara, elalav reisha b'avodah zarah v'seifa b'shar mitzvah. So it must be that the reisha that says that Shabbos is more chomer than avodah zarah, that's referring to avodah zarah. That Shabbos, if you do multiple malachos b'halamecha, you're chayiv multiple karbonos. While by avodah zarah, if you do multiple avodas for avodah zarah be'elam echad, you would not be chayiv. You only be chayiv one korban. The seifa, but the seifa where it says that other mitzvahs are more chomer than Shabbos, that's referring to other mitzvahs. B'shogag b'loy mischaven b'shari mitzvahs hechet. So what would be the case? The sover the shumanhu, there was a piece of meat. He thought it was shuman. He thought it was mortatit. But achlei he ate it. There, of course, we know he's chayiv a shoygig. He's chayiv a korban. That's a classic case of shoygig. Masheke b'Shabbos the potter. On Shabbos he would be potter because nischaven lachtech es hatolish. And this is the culmination. This is finally where Rava proves his point. The case of shuman is I planned to eat a piece of meat. I wanted to eat a piece of meat. I thought this piece of meat was shuman. It ended up being chaylev. That's why I'm chayiv over there. But by Shabbos, if I was planning to cut tolish, and I cut mechuber, nischaven lachtech is a tolish, v'chadash mechuber, that's a parallel case because the meat is the cutting. In each case, I wanted to eat meat, and in each case, I ate meat. Over there, I ate meat. It turned out it was chaylev. Here too, I wanted to cut, and I ended up cutting. But the thing that I ended up cutting was going to be osir. So the halach is there. It's potter. So Rava from his pshat that he finally got pshat in the brisa, Rava says the brisa is comparing Shabbos, or it's contrasting Shabbos with other averos. By chaylev and shuman, even though I had intended to eat meat, but it turned out that it was chaylev. For that, I have to bring a korban. I have to bring a chatas for it. By Shabbos, since the brisa says that by Shabbos it will be potter, I have a raya from the brisa that even though I plan to do a chaticha, nevertheless, since the chaticha that I planned to do was mutter, and it turned out that I did a chaticha was osir, then the brisa you see that by Shabbos that would be potter. Zok Abaye, no, I have a different shot in the brisa. Shogag v'loy mischaven, that we're comparing other verses to Shabbos, is not a place where I had intended to eat meat. Because in that case by Shabbos, in the parallel case by Shabbos, in fact, you would be chayiv Shabbos. Rather, the contrast that the brisa is making between other averos and Shabbos is the savar roiku. It was dissolved fat. Dissolved fat is a liquid. He thought that it wasn't fat at all. He wasn't planning to eat meat. He thought it was saliva. Saliva you can't even eat. You could swallow it, but you can't eat. So it's not a ma'isa chila, it's a ma'isa belia. So he had no intention to eat a piece of meat at all. He had intention merely to swallow right. Ubola, and he swallowed it. And over there, you say, if it turns out that it was chaylev, he'll be chayiv anyway, even though he had no intention of even eating. Nevertheless, he's still chayiv achatos, but when it comes to chaylev. Mashenken b'Shabbos, the potter, in which case, not he had intended to cut anything, he just had an intention to pick up the knife. And as he picked it up, by mistake, he sliced off something that was mechuber. That's where by Shabbos would be potter. But in your case, Rava, if you actually intended to cut, you just intended to cut tolush, and by mistake you cut mechuber, chayiv by Shabbos, Avaya holds that would be chayiv achatos. I guess we can stop here.
Yeah.
So this is a hard Gemara today.
First case. Sorry. Going back to that first case of on the top of oven base on base. Why does Rashi have to say the strange case of that it's a knife? Why doesn't it just types the words? Like B.S. Atolish, he bent down to pick up a stalk of wheat that he thought was detached, and it ended up being attached.
And he ripped it out?
And he ripped it out, I guess.
The only thing I can think of is, practically speaking, it takes a little bit of effort to rip it out. You wouldn't be able to do that by mistake. But if you're holding a very sharp knife, just lifting it could slice something on the way up. But Pashtus, it would have worked. If someone was such a strong guy, just lifting it up wouldn't even realize.
I can't remember. I don't know. I can't remember the last time I pulled a piece of wheat out of the ground. Go ahead.
I know carrots aren't so hard.
That I don't know why.
Okay, Shkoyach.
Yes, if you can remember to stop the stream.